Poddin My Noggin, hosted by CK Sims, creating a platform to elevate, educate, and heal by creating a space where people can share their stories of struggle, triumph, and redemption. CKS Media.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Poddin My Noggin. I'm your host, as always, CK Sims, and today we are joined by an author, a producer, I believe a director. You have a lot of accolades, actually, so you got a lot of things going on. Mr. Larry Bograd, welcome to the show.
Thank you, CK. Happy to be here.
All right. So, your book, Blood Flow, a son's 40-year journey to understand his father's suicide. That's an interesting name. I love the name. It feels poignant, right? It's what stops when someone commits suicide. It's what continues in the people they leave behind. And then clearly what has brought you through this 40-year journey is Blood Flow. Take us back. What do you remember about that day, that time?
Well, I guess I have a pretty good memory. And when you go through trauma like I did, a lot of that stuff is imprinted and you don't have much of a challenge calling it back up. I also benefited from taking a whack at a novel about my dad's suicide when I was 19. And the book was pretty bad, but it did allow me to capture a lot of information that was relatively fresh. That if I was to try to recapture that stuff now, it would be much more challenging. But in any event, I come from a Jewish family, grew up in suburban Denver. My dad was a well-respected physician. He had been born in Eastern Europe and came to the U.S. when he was 3. And he came west in 1940 to join an older brother who was already a doctor, who was going to put my dad through medical school and then join that practice. The uncle was here only because he had contracted TB, and at that time, Denver and Colorado was a center for TB homes where people assumed like the dry, high altitude air was going to help. Anyways, that's how my family ended up in Denver.
Okay.
In any event, I have an older sister, younger brother. We weren't particularly religious, but my parents did raise us to go to religious school and attend synagogue every so often. And the spring of 1966, I was turning 13, so there was a bar mitzvah for me. And there was a lot of busyness leading up to that. My dad seemed a little bit checked out, but the excuse my mom always gave about him was he had a bad back, or he was working so hard to pay for everything. But in any event, at my bar mitzvah, I finished the service, and what was kind of typical at the end of it, the bar mitzvah boy turns around, his man folk, father, uncles, grandfather, if any of them are there, all stand to embrace him, ask congratulations. And when I approached my dad, he had this look on his face like I interpreted it that I had greatly disappointed him. And I couldn't figure out how, because I'd actually done a pretty good job. There was Hebrew and speech to memorize and all that stuff. And then when I went to hug him, he gave me like the most tentative possible hug. He just kind of like touched the back of my shoulder, but nothing very warm. And that also just kind of reinforced the sense that I had disappointed him. Anyway, 2 days later, there was a reception at friends of my parents' house, friends at the home of my parents' best friends, for people who'd come in from out of town. And we kids were sent outside and told not to come inside unless we needed to use the restroom or something. And it was at that meeting that I only learned about after he died that the host was a psychiatrist. Other people who were at that get-together were doctors or psychiatrists. My uncle, who he was in practice with, was at that event. And anyway, they were discussing how bad my dad's serious depression was.
With your
And
dad present?
yes,
Okay.
but said almost nothing. And so they were trying to decide what treatment should he have. And again, this is something I only found out long after my dad died. He had had 2 previous hospitalizations for serious depression. One was in 1949 when he came home from Trieste, Italy, where he had been an army doctor with the occupation forces and had gone to several DP, displaced persons camp, which even took 3 or 4 years after the end of the war, Holocaust survivors were still living in tents and stuff. And another time he went back east for hospitalization when I was probably 9, and all we were told was that he was going to a hospital to get some additional training done. So anyway, the decision was made that this time it would be best if he was hospitalized here in Denver and not, quote, run away from his problem. Plus, my mom could visit him every day. He could come home if it seemed to be appropriate. It ended up being a really bad decision because he ran into colleagues who would say, "What are you doing here?" Things like that. Anyway, he was there for about 12 days, and then my siblings and I were eager to see him that Saturday, 2 weeks after my bar mitzvah, because he was coming home on a day pass. And that morning he had an aberrant EEG, which wasn't read before he was released on this day pass. And in previous hospitalization records that I unearthed, there was this presence of potentially an inoperative brain tumor in his frontal lobe. So, and also it was a Saturday morning, and the group at the hospital, they were understaffed. It was like a skeletal crew. And so even though a psychiatric nurse pleaded with the resident not to send my dad home, the resident said he'll be fine. So anyway, he came home, and when my mom was outside gardening and my siblings and I were arriving from religious school, he locked himself in the bathroom and took his life. And so when we came up towards our house in the carpool, there was an ambulance with a door open in the back. There were police cars with their lights flashing. There were kids going up and down the street on their bikes. There were neighbors gathered. And, we kind of jumped out of the car, and our mom came out of the house before we could reach the front door. And she just said, "I need you kids to go across the street to the neighbors." And my sister said, what's going on? And she said, your dad has had a terrible accident. So we went to a neighbor, and then eventually ended up at our uncle's house. And probably 90 minutes later, I looked out and I saw my mom coming up the walk, looking totally washed out, with a best friend supporting her on one side, and another best friend supporting her on the other, like literally like carrying her like she. And then she entered the house, and she just said, "Kids, I need to see you in the backyard." And we went in the backyard, and she said, "Your father's dead." And during that interim time, I had all these crazy fantasies, like what kind of terrible accident could have caused an ambulance and police? Did he fall off a ladder? Did he get electrocuted? Did he accidentally go through glass door? And I still didn't quite understand what had happened until maybe a half hour later. I heard my uncle on the phone, and he was talking to the local paper, the Denver Post. And he said something to the effect of, I'm told you're the reporter who writes the obituaries. And I want you to know that your editor is a good friend of mine. And you could ask him about us. All I'm asking is one favor. Can you please leave out the fact that my brother committed suicide out of the newspaper? And then I finally understood what happened. So that kind of totally, as you can imagine, turned our life upside down.
Of course. I mean, you say you understood what happened. But at 13, could you, in that moment, truly understand what happened? Like,
Well,
on
I didn't understand all the emotional packing that went, or psychosis that went into the suicide. I mean, this wasn't like an accidental overdose or,
no,
something
it
like
was
that, right?
intentional.
I mean, he was determined. And I mean, weirdly enough, I knew what suicide was because the summer before Marilyn Monroe had died. And, everybody knew that she died from suicide. There's a lot of conspiracy thought, but, that she had overdosed on pills.
Mm.
And so, so I certainly knew what suicide meant. Um, but I really had no clue that my dad was in the throes of this psychotic depression. Weirdly enough, the day before he died, I was the only kid that ever went to the hospital to visit him. I went with my mom, and we walked down the street to get a bite to eat. And my mom said to my dad, "Don't you have something you want to tell Larry?" And he said, it was very haltingly. He said, "Son, I want you to know I'm sick, and it's not the kind of sickness that you're used to me treating patients for. And I don't know how long it's going to take me to get well, but I need you to basically take care of mom and your siblings and kind of be the man of the house." And at the time, it kind of like set me back on my heels. It's almost like I didn't want to hear it. I mean, I absorbed it, but I didn't want to hear it. And so, clearly he was thinking about things, well before he actually took his life.
That is for a 13-year-old to have to experience that, that's very heavy, right? For anybody to experience that. Like,
Yeah.
let's not age define, but like for a 13-year-old who's hitting puberty and growing into manhood to experience that, it's so heavy. So I wonder if I have so many questions, of course.
Please.
He looked disappointed at you at your bar mitzvah, and his hug was impersonal, as you had mentioned.
Yes.
I wonder if it was because he was so disconnected at that point, so deep in the throes of depression.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent supposition. I mean, I think he was so internalized and just trying to keep it together that,
Yeah.
you
And
know,
then when you were telling me about, so we're looking at, this was 1966, you said?
66.
Yeah. So we're looking at 1966, Denver, Colorado, practicing physician with mental health issues. That alone, in that time, in that location, even because we're looking at conservative, like a very conservative sort of part of the world, um, the implications of such a thing. I mean, I can understand why he, quote unquote, ran away to receive treatment elsewhere,
Sure.
because there was distance between his professional life and, because who's going to, I mean, I don't even know what the laws would have been back then. Were you even able to hold a license if you were institutionalized? Or
Actually, I don't know for sure.
because I can just
But
imagine.
the point you're making, which is spot on, is if you were a doctor with any kind of personal problems, much less mental health problems, and this is why my uncle did not want the cause of death in the newspaper because he thought it would hurt their medical practice.
Mm,
Plus, plus the treatment, as you well know, in the mid '60s was pretty primitive. I mean, there was no neuroscience, there was no targeted drug therapies, there was no mood disorder medications. It was like still back then, fairly heavy electric shock treatment and lithium, which
which is
was kind of
strange.
like a pretty bad catch-all for almost any kind of everything from schizophrenia to depression. So
And now you find people predominantly only on lithium if they're in schizophrenia or have full blown bipolar disorder. Like,
right,
it's not prescribed the same way it is
right,
anymore. And lithium, for anybody listening and not actually aware, is a zombie drug. that's how I would classify it. It literally just shuts down your full emotion and you become a walking zombie, which if he was on lithium, which I don't know if he was, but that would only perpetuate the depression and the disconnection and all of those things. So,
it was a very primitive time in terms of mental health treatment, as you know. In the medical record from his hospitalization in 1949, in the medical records, the psychiatrist was writing up these notes saying, if he doesn't improve, we might consider a frontal lobotomy. I mean, the stuff
thank
just
God
gives you
for,
chills now, doesn't it?
yes, but like, thank God for continued research and progress in medicine and government and all and scientists and all of those people, because can you imagine if they didn't progress with their treatments what they would be doing to people today,
Oh, yeah.
right? So thank God that didn't happen. You had mentioned either on the form or somewhere on your website, which we're going to talk about as well, that at that time, apologies, but at that time, so I don't know if you've ever had a puppy before, but this is my very first one, and no one actually made me aware of how much work they are. But I love her. So you had indicated that at that time, people were being people. Let's break it down to what it was, and trying to convince you to be angry or pissed off that he would do this to you, trying to paint him out as a bad person, essentially. And how did you at 13 or 14, whenever this came about, I guess you were still 13, combat that? How did you make the decision to not adopt that anger?
And the other thing that you could add to that is back then people viewed people who were suicidal as weak, right?
Yes.
They took the easy way. He took the easy way out.
Yeah.
So there was not only the thing that you alluded to, but also just the social stigma. It's still around. I mean, there's there's still it's kind of viewed. It's still viewed very judgmentally, I think, by many people.
It is. It definitely is. I think we've made a lot of progress towards that,
I agree.
because I think there's been a lot more openness about it, a lot more documentation, a lot more literature. It's written into stories, it's shown in television. Like, so there's more saturation, I guess, of that topic. The idea that they've taken the easy way out pisses me off. And I will share with you briefly that at 35, I tried to take my life. It was all planned out. It was a perfect plan. Somehow the universe had different plans. So I failed at doing so. But I wasn't taking the easy way out.
Yeah.
I was tired. I was exhausted. Like, I didn't have the energy to do anything ever. And I had tried every therapy, every medication, everything. And in the end, it was not the easy way out. It was an escape, right? So to me, that's something, when people say that, it sends off a fire in me, because I'm like, unless you are familiar with the darkness and the hopelessness, then you don't know.
Yeah.
Right? You never actually know. But so how did you decide?
So yeah, if I can go back to your question, so my mom came home from therapy, and she was the one who gathered my sister, who was 14, and my brother, who was 12, and said, "Kids, I want you to know it's okay to be furious at Dad. I'm not saying he ruined our life, but we're going to have to sell the house. I'm going to go back to work. A lot of the things that you used to enjoy, we're not going to be able to afford anymore. And he deserted us. And it's okay to be angry at him." And I don't know. I just never went there. I was kind of a nerdy, undersized kid. And so I just kind of developed. I guess I'm kind of wired to be compassionate when, when I'm not being a jerk, right? But I do consider myself a compassionate person, and it just felt bad faith if I wasn't going to show compassion towards my dad, who 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 I think must have been tortured, you know, at least internally. So that was one thing. I mean, also, I was the only one of my siblings that went into therapy very soon after he died, and I worked with a great child psychologist, and we rarely talked about my dad. But it was just nice to have support.
Of course.
So I think that's another thing that helped my decision. But I actually I have never ever had that kind of anger towards him, because I just assumed that his mind was in such a, to your point, dark, hopeless place. And it's interesting, when I talked to a doctor about his last hospitalization. This is years later, and he kind of looked at me at the end. He said, "I'm amazed your dad made it to 49, given his mental health history, given all the changes in his life. He had lost a father at an early age. He had immigrated. He'd been shipped off to the war and things like that." And he just kind of said, "I know this sounds kind of bizarre, but yeah, I think I'm actually amazed your dad made it to 49." And then later, I had a friend's father who's a neuroscience look at the hospital records, and he just basically said, "I think your dad would have been dead by 56 at the outset." So, I think he hung in there as long as he could. And I think for me to, I never felt he ruined my life. He certainly changed my life. There's maybe I'm making it up or not, but I've always thought that I would not have ended up in the creative arts if my dad had lived longer. That I think I would have been kind of, heading for that, lawyer, doctor, professor, I don't know, something much more mainstream.
I was going to say, and this is not to be, I'm a transparent person, something more Jewish is what I was about to say, right? Because I have Jewish friends.
Fair enough.
And their families are very
Yeah.
These are like the list of professions,
Yeah.
and these are what you aspire to be. And it's but that said, if we look at our current, and not just current, but the last century of creatives, some of our most brilliant creatives ever have been Jewish. And it's like they've blessed us with just, anyway, that's a whole nother podcast.
Yeah.
But
I would just say that I think if you look at any outsider population, a minority population, including women,
yes,
even though they potentially outnumber men, but that's where the best, that seems to be where the most important art comes from.
I like how you said important.
Even in fields that are very hard for these outsiders to break into, sexism, racism, anti-Semitism, whatever. If you look back, I agree with you. I mean, Irving Berlin is a Jew who wrote White Christmas. So I mean, Gershwin wrote Rhapsody in Blue, and endless actors and composers and artists and people like that. So yeah, I think you make a good point.
I'll toot my own horn. Maybe sometimes I make good points.
Sometimes what? Toot your own horn? That's okay.
Yes. We're going to take a quick break, and we're going to come back and talk more about your book and other aspects of your life.
Partner today with CK Sims and Poddin My Noggin to get in front of an audience that cares. You will be supporting mental health stories, tales of resilience, and uplifting content, aligning your brand with bringing goodness, authenticity, and kindness front and center. This spot could be yours. Do you have a story of struggle and resilience? One that you want to share with others and possibly help someone through their own struggles? Find the link in the show description and fill out the guest form today.
Welcome back, everybody. Before the break, we have been talking to Larry Bograd about a very traumatic time in your life, very heavy time in your life, and one that's shaped very much your life. Didn't ruin it, like you said, but changed it. So the book that you've written is called, once again, Blood Flow: A Son's 40-Year Journey to Understand His Father's Suicide. So we talked about what went down during and a little after. When did you decide that you needed to know more, that there was the direction that you were lacking details and you wanted to start filling in gaps?
Probably my late teens. I started reading about suicide. I somehow stumbled upon Albert Camus, the Algerian French philosopher, who said, suicide is the existential decision, one way or the other. Right? And so I started reading a bunch of stuff like that. And I think what happened is I always knew I wanted to be in the arts. I mean, I would have loved to have been an actor, but I have this wonderful monotonous voice and had trouble memorizing stuff. And I as a kid, I enjoyed cartooning. So I came to writing pretty late, and I came to reading fiction very late. But as I said, I decided when I was 19, I had a semester in England, college semester, and I just basically gave myself the challenge to come home with a novel. And so that was the time I first brought all this memories and investigation together. And I did subsequent investigation, of course. And then this is a kind of wacky project. I mean, I have probably written and rewritten and changed it and revised it. I can't even, numerous times. I mean, innumerable times. But basically, I would produce a version maybe every decade. And I tried different voices. I would go from just basically being like a third-person omnipotent narrator to a first-person narrator to writing it like journalism. I tried it as a screenplay. I mean, I had a lot of evolution to decide how I wanted to do it, how I was going to deal with chronology, because I was dealing with my dad's childhood, my childhood, the bar mitzvah stuff, my journey to put all this information together, and then this unexpected open heart surgery when I was 53 years old. And then when that happened, part of my determination to get better was basically, pledging to myself that I would not leave my wife a widow and I would not leave my 3 daughters fatherless, as what happened to me when I was young. So that's how these, all these elements started evolving and deepening this memoir. And at one time, probably 10 years ago, I had a friend who was a literary agent, and I sent it to her, that version. And she said, "This is amazing. I'm going to put it up for auction." So for your listeners who don't know, an auction means that an agent sends a manuscript to several publishing houses at the same time, assured that someone's going to buy it, and then it's whoever bids the most money for the advance. So anyway, she submitted it, and nobody took a bite on it. So then I just went back and I put it away. But I was just determined. I'm almost going to be I'm 72 next week. Crazy enough.
Wow.
So at some point you have to say, fish or cut bait, right? I mean,
Yes.
either. And so I just decided to do it one more time. And even that version, I had trouble getting agents to read it because the New York publishing is just, romance, fantasy, science fiction. That's what sells largely, right? But anyway, I was having lunch with a former workmate of mine who had started his own publishing company, and I told him this. I just told him about the book, and he got more and more engrossed. And this half an hour lunch ended up being 90 minutes. And then at that point, he said, "I'd love to publish the book." So that's how it actually got into book form. And, along the way, it also changed. I mean, some years ago, my brother read a version and he said, "You know what's missing from your book?" I go, "Well, I don't know. What do you think?" He goes, "Humor." I said, "Well, this is not a particularly humorous topic." He goes, "Yeah, but you're funny and you're a funny writer. And you'd be doing a disservice not to find, even if it's all self-deprecating, what a nerd I am type humor, right?" So there were aspects of that where I tried to incorporate that too, so that it wasn't just, again, kind of modulation of the narrative voice and things like that.
Well, and
So
I
yeah,
think
I finally solved it, I thought. And weirdly enough, we have five grandsons, and the youngest is going to be one in a couple of weeks, and he was born on the day my father died, May 21st. And that became to me just like kind of like a message from Cosmos saying, "You've come full circle, and life continues. New life continues." So
yeah, I love the call out by your brother, right? If you're funny in life and you're funny in your writing, finding that voice and infusing that in the book as well makes it more authentic to you.
yeah,
So, what perspective did you take in the end? I want to read it now. So, but
I took the perspective that I'm a fortunate man. That I have a level of understanding of my parents that most people never have or likely want to have. And I know they did the best they could with what they had, who they were. And fortunately, I when I got married in 1988 to a fabulous woman, also a talented writer. We have daughters where we are loving family, and have each other's back all the time and make each other laugh all the time. And so, it's kind of weird. Like my mom was not a physically affectionate person, and she never said "I love you" until she lived to be almost 102.
oh wow,
And my sister, who's a family therapist who lives in Boston, would come out to visit, and we'd go see our mom at the senior living place. And I would say, "Well, okay, I'm going to, love you, Mom." And my mother would just kind of look at me. And then my sister would be coaching my mom, saying, "Mom, you have to say, 'I love you.' Larry said, 'I love you.' He's leaving." I mean, we're the family that I was fortunate enough to have with my wife and daughters. I mean, we say it every text. We say it whenever we're together. And so, I think I just consider myself really fortunate. I mean, when I wake up in the morning and I go outside, we live in the foothills of the Rockies. You know,
very nice.
I look at the vista. Hopefully it's not too cold, uh, and I just go and I hear birds. It's just like it's great to be alive. So I feel pretty fortunate.
What's so beautiful listening to you talk is I hear so many parallels about my life now, right? When you live in gratitude, you see so much more than you do when you live in a place of contrariness or negativity or whatever that may be.
Yeah,
And like just the things that you're talking about, like a scene, walking. I don't live in the mountains, but I live in the city. But when I walk out and there's that stillness in the air, that quietness in the early morning, like I just breathe that in, and it's like, gosh, I'm like, I'm here, I'm alive. Like this is wonderful. Just the little things and that gratitude. So, and I love that. I love what you're talking too about your family being a family of I love yous in every text. And I don't know what the alternative is for me because weirdly, I have a brother who has the emotional range of a turnip. Sorry if he's watching this. I'm sure he's not, but he's a great man, very brilliant, done very well in his life, but he's just not an emotive person at all, right? However, like the rest of my family, family, even my extended family, like we can't talk to each other without saying I love you in departure. Like it's just a part of how we grew up or how we were raised. My aunt, she lives downstairs. I live in the top part of the duplex. Um, she married an Italian man, so this is why this arrangement has worked out for me. I see her like 5, 6 times a day. Every time I leave that house, I tell her I love her, and she tells me I love. She loves me back. I mean, it's beautiful to experience that and to be living in that life when you can share this.
And I think the other thing, you talked about being a contrarian or judgmental. I mean, one thing about trauma is there are victims.
Yes.
But I never really considered myself a victim of my dad's suicide. I was a survivor of it. And listen, there's plenty of people who have every right to identify as a victim.
Oh my gosh, yes.
But if you're fortunate and you have the kind of, strength and resilience and likely get some help, it'd be, as much as you can get off that spot.
Victimhood.
Yeah.
It's I always interject a lot of my own life. I lived in a sense of victimhood for 35 years, right? And which was also layered with some form of, I don't even know where it came from, entitlement. Very bizarre. And yeah, you're right. But I feel like healed people or emotionally intelligent people are able to distinguish that, right? Like not being a victim of suicide, your father's suicide, but being a survivor of it. That's a very big distinction,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it allows you to sit with it and acknowledge the traumatic event and that you did endure pain and grief and trauma from that experience. However, you were a survivor of it, not a victim of it. And there are people out there, like you said, that yes, definitely have right to use the word victim because it is the way it is. But yes, if you can find, like you said, there's a way to move into even just tiny baby steps of trying to find the gratitude in a day, in a moment, your life will.
And I mean, I'm fortunate in that I've never had trauma directed at me.
Mm-hmm.
I had a traumatic thing happen, but it wasn't like I was pulled into some craziness myself. You know what I mean? Does that make sense
Yeah,
to you?
absolutely.
And I think it's also, that's another reason why it would be bad faith for me to claim I was a victim because, I was changed and I've grieved and, even today there's certain things images I see and stuff like that just takes me right back to the moment, right? But on the other hand, I'm not a casualty of war or physical assault or, any number of horrible things that, I imagine would be much harder to overcome than what I had to overcome.
I don't know. I
Yeah.
don't have an answer for it, right? And I always also tend to, my stance is I never try to measure because whether that you saw yourself this way or not, who am I to try and discern what your experience was, right?
Mm-hmm.
And because that is in fact a form of judgment on anybody, when you stack the cards, if you will,
Right.
against what somebody else is. But I don't have the answer to that. I have been assaulted. It was impactful, but I don't think I ever really felt like I was the victim. For me, changed me, scared the living out of me because I was only 15 and he was 35. But yeah, like I don't think I ever went through life feeling as a victim from that. There's a scar, there's emotional scars that are there, right?
Wow.
But at the end of the day, I'm alive and get to have this conversation with Larry Bograd, right? So like it's interesting topic, which I'm sure we could have like 6 hours of podcast on.
You'll have to have me back, CK.
I will, definitely. So the book is available online, bookstores, the works, correct?
And also, if you go to my website, which is just my name.com, LarryBograd.com, there's
Yeah, we're
ways
gonna
to
link
order
that.
it there.
But also, like, I also see this other book called Bad Apple.
Oh, yeah.
And is that the book that you've referenced a couple times about like your first novel when you were in England?
No, no, no. I had a, I, I, I got a master's in English from the University of Washington, Seattle, and drove all the way to New York. And my master's thesis was a kind of postmodern Western. And I thought, oh, this is easy. I'll sell this novel, and I'll just have the life of a novelist. Well, nobody was interested in that book, so I backed into a job at a children's book publishing company, and then through that, I published a book for an illustrator that we wanted to highlight. So I published some picture books, and then I published some young adult books and some middle grade books before I ran into enough book banning and censorship that nobody would buy anything from me. So Bad Apple was one of the books, young adult books, YA books that I wrote.
Okay.
And I was living in New York, and a summer or two earlier, this very wealthy family up living in Westchester, this affluent,
Sorry.
living in Westchester, this affluent area north of the city. He had used to be like the editor-in-chief of Reader's Digest. Anyway, there was a home invasion, and they were murdered, and clearly there was robbery involved. And the police were convinced that it was a hit job, professional criminals. And then they couldn't never quite solve the case. And then months later, they arrested two teenagers in Brooklyn because one of them had bragged on the playground that he had convinced his buddy to go up and commit this murder. And so that's really what the basis of that book. It's about a kid who's had a very traumatic life, and he's kind of like groomed, if you will, not sexually, but emotionally groomed by a friend who's kind of a renegade guy to go commit this crime, and it goes haywire, and they end up killing this couple. So that was a book that got some really good reviews, and also was a book that self-appointed censors and protectors of children thought had no place in a public or school library. So
Yeah, but
that's a
so
whole other
like,
book. I mean, there's 11.
but
Go ahead.
if there's like, if you have banned books, like now's the time to shop that because people are all about these days banned books.
I
Like,
know.
there's a whole freaking movement surrounding, like, we're going to find the banned books and we're going to read the banned books because nobody can tell us what we're allowed to digest, right? So you could be here's all the banned books.
One of my dreams, fantasy dreams, is that this memoir gets into the right people, and then they want to somewhere along the line, I get these books that are out of print back into print. I also wrote a book called The Better Angel about a teenage love triangle, two guys and a young woman. And was it graphic? Well, I mean, there's some sex in it. But that's the one that probably destroyed my career. And then a publishing company in England had published Bad Apple. And so I was there just, on vacation holiday, and I went to the agent there who represented me, and I'd sent him a copy of The Better Angel ahead of time. And, very gracious British guy. And he just said, I'm afraid to tell you, well, first of all, let me tell you, that's the single best book I've ever read about adolescent sexuality. And I would never be able to sell it because of the controversy it might cause. So this was
So it never got
also
published.
like 20, 30 years ago too. I mean, the nowadays young adult books are just well, I mean, there's still obviously people who want to keep them out of the hands of poor impressionable children, but I think the times have changed. To your point, times have changed where there's a lot more accepted now than there was when I was more active in that field.
Well, I think to be first honest with you, to get a book banned, that would be an honor. Like honestly. So was that book ever published?
Yeah, it was
Ever?
published by Harper here in the States, and a mass market paperback that was put out.
And
Um,
that was, oh yes, because you said that's the book that you in.
right,
That's so interesting. And so who owns the rights of those books now?
I do. I mean, typically what happens is at some point, if a book's not selling, the publisher will decide to take it out of print
Mm-hmm.
so that they don't clog their catalog. You know, they're more intent on selling proven sellers and new titles. And so they contact the author and they say, we're going to destroy all copies of the book in our warehouse and we're going to declare it out of print. Do you want to buy any copies before we incinerate them or whatever? You know, so you buy 50 copies and you drag them around in a box for years and years. But in any event, once they take it out of print, all rights revert back to the author.
So why even bother yourself with a publisher? Go and publish those on your own.
Well, maybe it's a grind, though. You know, I'm discovering it. I mean, I was published by an independent press, which is, to being honest, it's a far cry from a major New York City publisher.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't have the publicity machine, I don't have the marketing machine, I don't have the sales force. And there's some crazy number of books published every year. A lot of them self-published, or they put it through a vanity press where they're basically paying a publisher to put the book out. I mean, we're talking about millions of copies.
Of
So
course.
it's very saturated out there. And yeah, I could probably put them back into print, but I don't know if it's really worth the effort. I don't know if it would reach too many.
Well, I would imagine the biggest effort for you right now would be to transcribe them into digital formats,
Yes, true.
right?
Yeah, I mean, it
After
would probably be
that,
easy enough to put them out as ebooks. I definitely could do that.
exactly. Let them be heard and read by the masses, especially like if you can have the covers updated to say like previously banned or things like that, like that's your marketing right there.
You, CK,
You
I've been looking for a business manager, and I think I found it.
well, I'm a transformation consultant by trade.
Okay.
So like I look at people who want to go from here to there and look at filling it in. But like banned books, like I feel like that's like one of the biggest honors to have as a literary person. Like your book was so controversial that people banned it. And it quote unquote cost you your novelist livelihood, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So like that alone is a pitch that if you put that in the right sort of medium on TikTok or Instagram or whatever you're thinking about, that is going to be your marketing machine. People are going to want to know, why was this book, what did you say it was called again?
The Better Angel.
The Bitter Angel or the Better Angel?
Better.
Better Angel.
The better
Better
angel of our
Angel.
nature. It's a Lincoln quote.
So yeah, so that would, people are going to want to read it
But
based on that fact alone.
the whole self-appointed holier than thou book banner censorship. They once objected to a book I wrote about a girl living in poverty because it was about a girl living in poverty, and we don't want our children to think that there's anybody out there who's not living the good life. I mean,
Oh yeah,
it's
because we want our
not just
children
sex and drugs is what I'm saying. There's also all kinds of crazy political stuff. So
of course, but I mean, and that stuff drives me nuts too because you're just sheltering them and you're lying to them. You are setting them up for some form of failure by not telling them what the world really is and what it looks like and what they could potentially come face to face with.
if I can just
Right?
tell you a very, very quick story on this.
Of
So
course.
I was asked to speak at a local library, and my wife decided to come sit in on it. And I read a little bit from the books, nothing too hot. And then I opened it up to questions, and this woman raised her hand and said, on page 46 of your book, Travelers, you have the protagonist smoking marijuana and talking about wanting to try cocaine. This book should be under lock and key, or it shouldn't even be in the library at all. And then I said, I said, well, did you actually read a couple of pages later where he regrets that he made that decision? And then my wife, who's a wonderful advocate, stood up and she just said, and she was hot, angry. And she said to this woman, do you really believe that one book is going to destroy all the parenting that you've done for this child for their entire life? Are you that insecure to think that one book or any book would, basically, convince your kid to go out there and murder old people for money, or become a drug addict or what, but they never quite ever get to that thinking because they're playing the holier than thou card of protecting morals. So.
Yes, well, that's also another podcast. So you are you're an award-winning though author for children's books, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So I want to just talk about some of these things. So for people at home interested in Blood Flow, a son's 40-year journey to understand his father's suicide, do you now fully understand and have the whole picture? Will they get the whole progression?
I think they will. I think they will. Yeah.
Okay, that's good to know.
And
then
go ahead.
You are the co-producer and co-director and editor of 2 documentary features. One called The First, I Can Tell the
World.
Sorry, I Can Tell the World.
Mm-hmm.
So that's about the history of spirituals music. Tell us about that real quick.
So I was very interested in Frederick Douglass, and I was on the board of a local theater here in town that was run by an African American man, and they didn't necessarily do all black plays, but they always found, they would have actors in it, and they often did plays about the the African American experience. And so I went up to him and I said, how would you feel if I put together some of Frederick Douglass's speeches and you could do it? And so he decided that he would do the young Douglass and he would hire an older actor to do the older Douglass. And then he had this wacky idea. There was this group in town called the Spirituals Project, which was a purposely integrated choir devoted to slave songs or plantation songs. Like, and there's so many songs that you think are folk songs. If I Had a Hammer, I mean, there's so many songs that are actually spirituals and people don't even know it. Follow the Drinking Gorge, I mean, all this stuff, right? And so he had this idea of combining the spirituals projects, actually singing at the end of this show. And then that thing became even more involved because they were giving a recital at the University of Denver auditorium. And so the actors were in front of a black screen. And when they finish, the screen comes up and there's a 45-person choir in rows singing spirituals. And so at that point, there was a person in the audience who was an attorney who had done pretty well suing corporations. And he basically said, I'll put up the money if you you and your wife turn this into a documentary. So that's how that one came about. So it was a combination of following this choir, getting the people's stories, and then also talking to some experts about, this American music. So it played a couple of festivals and won an award. It was briefly available like on iTunes and stuff, but then the distributor went out of business. And then the other one was about what girls and women keep in their purse, the contents of their purse, and how it changes from a little girl to an old woman. So, the little girl would say, this is a bracelet I got at McDonald's. And the old lady would go, here's my handicap parking sticker, but I don't drive anymore. Here's batteries for my hearing aid, So that was a lot of fun, and my wife narrated that as well. So, yeah, those were fun. But again, they didn't really get into the right hands to get much mass viewing.
Which is unfortunate, but I feel like the creation of such things yes, everybody wants to get their flowers and receive accolades or have their work be shown to the masses. But I also think that the act of the creation is in itself a journey worth taking,
Yeah.
regardless of where it ends up. Even if it's viewed by one person, it's a piece that
Yeah. Like when I was in my 40s or something, I was just totally depressed about my career. And I was in therapy at the time, and I was, bemoaning all this to my therapist. And at the end of it, she said, "Do you still identify as a writer?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm a writer." She said, "Well, then that's who you are. You don't have to say I'm a failure, or that I never got a break, or that I'm a writer who never sold well. It's who you are. It's what you've chosen to do with, what time is available to you." So, to that extent, I have enjoyed the creative process. I have never, it's very rarely that I don't feel a lot better at the end of doing something creative than before. I know there's all
yeah,
these stories of creative people who are tortured artists and blah, blah, blah. That's not me. So it's really been a wonderful thing that I can fall back on and, escape to.
being creative is wonderful. And if I could somehow figure out how to truly take all of the wildly imaginative things that happens in here and get them out into the world, I'm sure that would be wonderful. But I don't know. That I think I was. It was one of those curses that you get, right?
Mm.
Where you can sit back and imagine this full blown beautiful thing, and then you go to get a pen and it's gone.
Mm.
It's no longer there anymore.
I think,
But yeah, so what is next for you at 72? You still have lots of life left, right?
yep,
Because genetically, like your mom lived to 102.
almost,
You said
yeah.
almost 102.
Yeah.
So
And I had uncles, my father's brothers that lived into their 80s. So yeah, I should be around for a while. I take care of myself.
good.
Um, I'm maybe working on another memoir that updates the years I lived in New York City. I just retired after 30 years in the corporate world where I made a living as an instructional designer, creating training. And so,
Yeah.
I might write a satire about that experience, even though I enjoyed it. But I mean, I just think it's ripe for corporate America. It's just ripe for that.
Well, I think
I've always wanted to write about the American West, so I might, I've been researching a book on that. So yeah, I will have no shortage of things that I am happy to be retired, so I can spend more time working on those.
wonderful. And for people at home who want to continue to follow, they can check out larrybograd.com and follow along. I would urge everyone out there to get out and pick up a copy of Blood Flow, a son's 40-year journey to understand his father's suicide. I myself definitely want a copy now. I want to read it. And I want to thank you very much for being a guest on the show today. And I wish you incredible many years to come.
Well, I appreciate it,
Um,
and I really enjoyed this conversation. I know that's how you like your podcast to go, but I really thought it was a lot of fun talking to you and insightful. So thank you.
I appreciate that. It's definitely how I like it to be, is to be more of a conversation than a constant sort of
Right.
barrage of questions, right?
Yeah.
For everybody at home, thank you for tuning in and get out there. And until next time, live your wildest dreams. We'll see you next time.
For media and sponsorship inquiries, email info@ccsims.com or visit ccsims.com and fill out the contact form. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. A new episode airs every Saturday. CKS Media.